Tonight we're heading somewhere the wind never stops tugging at your sleeves, where the air smells of salt and seaweed, and the horizon feels like a promise and a dare at the same time. The waves slap the shore with a steady rhythm, seagulls heckle you from above, and somewhere out there, the Baltic is churning in ways you probably wouldn't survive if you decided to just swim a little. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you are right now, and what time it is where you live. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on a Danish beach in the late 1600s, your boots sinking into wet sand, each step leaving a dark footprint that instantly fills with tiny rivulets of water. The wind is so persistent it tugs your coat open no matter how tightly you clutch it, and the air tastes like iron, like the ocean has secrets it's daring you to uncover. Beside you, a boy of maybe 12 is squinting into the drift of sea mist. His cloak is finer than anything you've seen on this coast, the fabric thick and lined with fur against the cold. You know he's a prince, though no one's supposed to use the title when he comes out here. A tangle of kelp catches your boot, and as you bend to untangle yourself, your fingers brush something smooth and oddly perfect among the rocks. You pull it free, it's a glass bottle, sealed with wax hardened to a dull brown. Inside is a ship no bigger than your hand, its sails white as bone, its rigging impossibly delicate. The hull is painted deep red, the kind of pigment that would have cost more than some fishing boats. The boy's eyes go wide as he sees it, and you can't help noticing that in the middle of all this wind and cold, his whole world has just rearranged itself around that bottle. Mainstream historical fact: Danish royalty of the late 17th century often spent time on coastal estates, both for leisure and to inspect harbors. Seafaring was central to Denmark's power. Quirky tidbit: sailors sometimes left small, handmade models in bottles as tokens of luck, tossing them into the sea to drift until found by someone worthy. Historians still argue whether these bottles were really meant as gifts for strangers, or if they were simply lost possessions from long voyages. You hand it to him, expecting he'll just admire it for a moment before moving on, but instead he turns it over carefully, tracing the seams in the glass, peering at the sails like he's trying to memorize the stitch pattern. "How do they get it inside?" he mutters, almost to himself, and you realize this is not idle curiosity, this is the start of a puzzle that might just consume him. You've seen that look before in people who find something they can't let go of. The beach is nearly empty except for a hunched figure far down the shoreline, poking at the tide line with a stick. The prince barely notices him. He's kneeling now, holding the bottle against the light to see every angle. You watch him try to spot any clue in the wax seal, the tilt of the mast, the impossibly taut rigging that would snap if you so much as breathed on it wrong. He doesn't ask your opinion, he simply stands, dusts the sand from his cloak, and says, "We're keeping this." You fall into step with him as he strides back toward the path leading up to the cliffs, the bottle cradled in both hands like a fragile bird. The wind's still battering your ears, but it doesn't matter anymore. You've just seen the exact moment a lifelong obsession is born. Halfway up the path, a gust nearly knocks you sideways, and the prince laughs, not because it's funny, but because the storm feels like a challenge. "One day," he says, "I'll have hundreds of these. And they'll be better, bigger, stranger." You wonder if he realizes how ambitious that is, given that most people who try to make even one of these miniature ships end up with a pile of broken masts and frayed thread. But ambition is cheap when you're 12 and royal. The cliff path opens onto a grassy slope, the palace's distant spires poking up against a pewter sky. You glance back once at the sea, and for a split second, you swear you see another bottle bobbing in the shallows, only this one is upside down, like it doesn't care about being found. You make a mental note to check tomorrow, but you already know the prince will not let you rest until every inch of beach has been scoured. You trudge onward, boots heavy with wet sand, the sound of the sea fading into the muted thump of your steps. Somewhere behind those palace walls, this first little glass treasure will be tucked away, hidden from the eyes of those who won't understand. But for the prince, that single find will be like a compass needle fixed forever on more. And for you, well, you've just signed on for an adventure where the weather will rarely be calm, the company will always be interesting, and the bottles, they'll keep getting stranger. The climb from the cliffs up to the palace is longer than you'd like, especially when you're carrying wet boots and a gusty headwind, but the prince never slows. He's holding the bottle in both hands, balanced like an egg that could hatch into something dangerous if dropped. The palace gates loom ahead, black iron twisted into flourishes that look beautiful until you realize they're meant to keep people like you out. The guards spot him instantly, their spears lowering in a greeting that's more ceremony than defense. But their eyes flick toward you, toward the thing you're carrying under your arm. You pass the bottle back to the prince, because in this world, it's better if it's in royal hands. He tucks it under his cloak just as one of the guards steps forward. The man's gaze lingers on the bulge in the fabric. "Something from the shore, Highness?" His tone is polite but edged with that palace mix of curiosity and suspicion. You keep your face blank. The prince's expression is cooler, almost bored. "Just driftwood," he says. Driftwood that happens to clink faintly when he shifts it, but the guard either believes him or decides it's not worth challenging. Mainstream historical fact: Danish palaces in the 17th century were heavily guarded not only for security but to control what entered. From political pamphlets to foreign trinkets, both could be dangerous in their own way. Quirky tidbit: some nobles' households employed object clerks whose entire job was to log every item that came through the gates, from barrels of herring to exotic pets. Historians still argue whether such oversight was more about preventing smuggling or simply feeding the crown's appetite for cataloguing everything. Once inside the courtyard, the noise of the wind is replaced by the shuffle of servants and the clang of a far-off blacksmith. The prince veers away from the main hall, leading you toward a quieter side passage lined with portraits. The people in the paintings look stern enough to leap down and confiscate anything fun. You've been in the palace before, you know the main staircase is a trap for anyone carrying something they shouldn't. Too many eyes. Instead, you follow him through a narrow servants' corridor that smells faintly of starch and roasted nuts. A maid carrying a stack of linens nearly bumps into you, her eyes darting to the prince and then to the shape under his cloak. But she says nothing. Maybe she's learned that curiosity is a dangerous luxury in these halls. He leads you up a spiral stair that tightens like a corkscrew, the walls close enough that your elbows brush stone. The climb ends at a small landing with a locked oak door. He fishes a tiny key from a chain around his neck, something you didn't know he carried, and slips it into the lock. The hinges creak as the door swings inward, revealing a modest chamber with a narrow bed, a writing desk, and shelves stuffed with books and rolled maps. You'd expect the maps to be of the kingdom, maybe the Baltic trade routes, but one look tells you these are ship diagrams. Different kinds of masts, hull shapes, the measurements so precise you can almost hear the scratch of the draftsman's quill. This is not a random prince's study, this is already a shrine in the making. He closes the door behind you, then pulls the bottle free, setting it on the desk as if presenting a crown jewel. "No one will understand this," he says flatly. "Not father. Not the council. They'll say it's childish." His gaze sharpens. "So they won't see it." You feel a strange complicity settle over you. You've been enlisted in something secret, maybe even subversive. The kind of thing that would seem harmless to most, just a boy with a toy, but here, everything is political. A hobby can be spun into weakness. An object from outside the palace walls can be framed as evidence of disloyalty, or worse. He kneels, pulling a loose panel from beneath the desk. The space beneath is small but deep, lined with soft cloth. He places the bottle inside, covering it with a folded scrap of sailcloth before sliding the panel back. "There," he murmurs. "Safe." It's not just about hiding the object. You can tell by the way he lingers over the panel, fingertips brushing the seam, that the secrecy itself is part of the thrill. The moment the bottle went under that desk, it stopped being just a thing he found, it became contraband, a piece of the outside world smuggled into the fortress of rules. Later, as you walk the more public corridors, you catch glimpses of court life. Servants hurrying with trays, a scribe bent over a ledger, two ladies whispering behind fans. The prince greets no one dares to stop him. But you can feel the unspoken question in the air, what has he brought back this time? By the time you reach the Great Hall, you've already forgotten the weight of your wet boots. You're thinking about the panel under the desk, about the ship suspended in its little glass ocean, and about how much more dangerous it feels in here than it ever did on the stormy beach. By morning, the storm has calmed just enough to smear a pale light across the palace windows, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's been washed in milk. The prince waits until the court is distracted with breakfast, platters of fish, dense rye bread, and the kind of cheese you could use as a doorstop, before giving you the signal. You slip away from the long table, following him up those same spiral stairs from yesterday, each step creaking like it's tattling on you. At the top, he unlocks his study again, but instead of heading for the desk, he crosses to a narrow door half hidden behind a tapestry of some ancestor glaring at a battle scene. The door groans open, revealing a steeper, dustier staircase that seems to head directly into the palace's bones. Cobwebs brush your face, and you try not to think about the number of spiders you've just become landlord to. Mainstream historical fact: many European palaces had vast attic spaces used for storage, but also for hiding objects during times of political turmoil, sometimes even people. Quirky tidbit: in certain Danish estates, attics doubled as pigeon lofts, the birds used for both food and secret messaging. Historians still argue whether palace attics were more valuable for storage or for spying opportunities. The air grows warmer as you climb. Heat rises even in these drafty old walls. The staircase ends at a trapdoor that opens into a low-beamed space stretching the length of the building. Light filters in through small dormer windows, catching on swirls of dust. It smells of wood, wax, and something faintly sweet, like the attic has been quietly baking itself for centuries. Tucked against the far wall is a workbench that looks nothing like the neat furniture downstairs. This is raw wood, scarred with knife marks and dark rings where something hot once sat too long. The prince strides to it like a soldier returning to his post. You see tools laid out in careful disorder, tiny saws, tweezers, files, a set of delicate brushes so fine they could paint an ant's portrait. There's even a jar of what smells suspiciously like strong glue, the fumes curling up in slow, invisible ribbons. This, he says, is where it will happen. He's already pulling out a scrap of parchment and a stick of charcoal, sketching the bottle from memory, every line of rigging, every angle of sail. He talks as he draws, about building his own, about learning the secret of how to slip a ship into glass without breaking it or your sanity. You pick up one of the brushes, rolling it between your fingers. Do you know how they do it? You ask. He doesn't look up. Not yet. But I will. His voice has the kind of quiet certainty that makes you believe he could bend reality to fit his will, or at least force it to explain itself. On a shelf above the bench are jars filled with odd things, tiny carved anchors, miniature barrels no bigger than your fingernail, scraps of sailcloth so thin they're almost translucent. You can tell some of these have been scavenged from broken toys or stolen from decorative trims elsewhere in the palace. One jar holds only sand, each grain almost the same pale gold, like it was sifted from the beach with obsessive care. He sets the bottle you found on the bench, next to his tools, and leans in close, studying it like it's about to reveal a state secret. The light from the dormer window pools around the glass, making the water illusion inside gleam. For a second, it's like looking into a captured world, frozen waves, a ship forever mid-journey. Imagine, he says, Hundreds of these. Thousands. Every ship that's ever sailed, right here where I can see them. You imagine it, row after row of glass bottles, each holding a perfect, impossible little voyage. The attic feels bigger just thinking about it. The first attempt comes that same day. He pulls out a small bottle from a crate under the bench, its surface cloudy with age. You're tasked with cutting the tiniest planks from a sliver of wood, your hands cramping as you try to keep each piece uniform. He works beside you, fitting a miniature hull together with tweezers, pausing only to mutter about the glue setting too fast or the sail being a fraction too wide. By the time the sun begins to dip, the bottle is still empty. The ship's frame lies on the bench, delicate and incomplete, its masts leaning like they're already tired. He sits back, rubbing his temples, and lets out a slow breath. It's harder than it looks, he admits. You resist the urge to point out that this might be why not everyone does it. Still, when you leave the attic, he's already making a list in his head, new tools he'll need, a better source for sailcloth, someone who can blow glass just the right size. You realize that this secret attic workshop isn't just a place to build ships. It's a place to build an obsession, piece by piece, until the whole palace has to pretend it doesn't know it exists. The next few weeks turn the attic into a strange mix of royal study and shipyard in miniature. You lose track of the number of times you've been sent down to the kitchens under the excuse of fetching more candle stubs when really, you're sneaking in bits of twine or thin wire hidden in your sleeves. Every visit to the coast means keeping an eye out for driftwood or smooth sea glass that can be repurposed. Then one morning, the prince summons you with the kind of urgency normally reserved for pirate attacks or breakfast pastries in danger of being eaten by someone else. When you get to the attic, you find him hunched over the workbench, smoothing the edges of a drawing. It's a commission order, and not just any commission, this one is addressed to a name you don't recognize, in handwriting that looks older and shakier than the prince's. Mainstream historical fact: in the late 1600s, retired sailors often made a modest living crafting model ships, sometimes for wealthy patrons who had never set foot on a real deck. Quirky tidbit: certain model makers were known to hide small messages or coins inside their ships before sealing them in bottles, a private joke or a secret between maker and owner. Historians still argue whether this was superstition, personal branding, or just boredom during long winters. The name belongs to an old sailor who supposedly lives in a hut on the far end of the harbor, a man whispered about for his unfair advantage in ship-in-a bottle making. Some say his eyesight is so sharp he can thread a needle in a thunderstorm. Others claim he's made a deal with something that lives in the deep. The prince dismisses the second rumor with a smirk, but you've learned his smirk often means I'll believe it when it benefits me. The tricky part is payment. The man doesn't accept gold, silver, or anything you can hand over without thinking. He wants stories, true ones. Tales of storms survived, ports visited, and seas crossed. The prince, being 12 and not yet allowed beyond the palace grounds without a small army, doesn't exactly have a bank of personal adventures. That's where you come in. So that's how you find yourself sitting by the attic window, helping him stitch together an authentic seafaring tale. You describe how the ship tilted so far to one side that the deck became the wall, how the crew tied themselves to the rail to keep from sliding into the churning black water. You throw in a detail about lightning striking so close it made the air taste like coins, which the prince decides is just the right amount of frightening. 2 days later, you're walking the harbor road, the prince's cloak had pulled low over his face. The air is heavy with the smell of tar and fish, the gulls overhead already calculating which of you might drop food first. The sailor's hut is smaller than you expected, leaning slightly to one side as if bowing to the wind. The man himself is no less weather-worn, skin like driftwood, eyes a startling pale grey that seem to look right through you. The prince delivers the story, word for word, his voice steady. The sailor listens without interrupting, nodding slowly at the mention of the lightning. When it's done, He simply says, "That's worth something," and shuffles to a shelf lined with bottles of various shapes. He selects one covered in a layer of dust so thick you can write your name in it. Inside, a three-masted galleon sits poised on a sea made from swirled blue paint and what looks suspiciously like ground shell. "This one's yours," the sailor says. "Took me months." The prince takes it with both hands, his face the picture of polite gratitude, until the door closes behind you and the mask drops into an unfiltered grin. "Worth it," he murmurs. Back in the attic, the galleon joins the beach-found bottle in its hiding place. You can already see the prince's mind leaping ahead, plotting the next commission, the next story, the next impossible piece to smuggle past the palace gates. And you realize something unsettling. This isn't just about collecting anymore. This is about acquiring the rare, the unrepeatable, the bottle ships that even seasoned collectors whisper about but never see. If the palace corridors could talk, they'd probably be whispering about the same thing the courtiers are: why the young prince keeps vanishing for hours at a time. Some of them chalk it up to studying the classics, others suspect he's getting into trouble, and a few just shrug, because it's easier to pretend not to notice. Still, when the latest acquisition, a sleek, black-hulled brig, mysteriously appears in his study for a few hours before being whisked up to the attic, you can almost hear the collective raise of aristocratic eyebrows. The first to comment is Countess Renz, whose hobby is spotting anything new in the palace and declaring it unsuitable. She catches sight of the brig while delivering some tedious lecture about family alliances. "What is that?" she demands, pointing a bejeweled finger. "A teaching aid," the prince replies smoothly, as if all royal children keep a small fleet of teaching aids in bottles. You bite the inside of your cheek to keep from laughing. Mainstream historical fact: Danish courts of the 17th century were rife with ceremonial etiquette, and even the hobbies of royals could be political. Hunting, riding, and chess were considered suitable. Anything childish could be seen as weakness. Quirky tidbit: some royal families kept court jesters well into this period, not for humor, but to indulge in harmless eccentricities on behalf of the royals themselves. Historians still argue whether these hobbies were truly personal interests or strategic displays of taste and culture. But the more the collection grows, the more you notice those sidelong glances. During a council dinner, a duke leans over and mutters, "Ships in bottles? How quaint. I suppose they take less space than a real navy." The remark draws a polite ripple of laughter, but the prince's jaw tightens. You know that look, it's the one he wore the day he decided to climb the attic stairs with his first contraband treasure. One afternoon, you arrive in the attic to find him rearranging his growing fleet with near-military precision. The bottles line the bench like recruits being inspected, each wiped clean of dust, each tilted just enough to catch the light. "They think it's a joke," he says without looking up. "They don't understand the patience it takes. The skill. They only value things they can march into battle." You help him adjust a delicate sloop so its painted prow faces exactly north. "Let them laugh," you suggest. "You'll outlast their fads." But you can tell he's already planning something bigger, something that will make even the Countess Renz of the world stop smirking. The opportunity arrives sooner than expected. During preparations for a small court exhibition, ostensibly to showcase gifts from visiting envoys, the prince volunteers to arrange a maritime display. No one stops him, perhaps expecting a few dusty maps and a compass or two. Instead, under the guise of educational enrichment, he sneaks in 5 of his best bottle ships, each perched on velvet stands, each with a handwritten card describing not just the vessel but the story behind it. By evening, the guests are clustered around the table, peering into glass oceans and muttering over the impossibility of the craftsmanship. A visiting merchant from Lübeck examines the brig for nearly 10 minutes before asking if it's for sale. The prince declines, of course, but the point has been made. Later, as the last guests trickle out, you catch Countess Renz lingering by the display. She doesn't speak to the prince directly, but she does reach out to adjust the angle of one bottle before leaving. It's not an apology, but it's close enough for court politics. That night, back in the attic, the prince lines the bottles up again. "Let them laugh," he says, but this time, there's a quiet satisfaction under the words. You get the feeling he's already thinking of the next acquisition, something so intricate it'll make even a duke swallow his clever little jokes. Winter loosens its grip on the coast, and the ice along the harbor edges begins to crack into floating plates that clink against one another like distant glass bells. The prince decides it's time to take the hunt beyond dusty attics and awkward court dinners. "We'll find them where they were born," he says, pointing on a map to a scatter of fishing villages along the Baltic. You can tell by his tone this isn't a suggestion, it's a campaign. The plan involves traveling under the guise of surveying coastal defenses. The royal guards assigned to the trip look mildly bored, clearly expecting to count cannons and return in time for supper. You, however, know the real mission, the Great Baltic Hunt. Mainstream historical fact: in the late 17th century, Denmark controlled key points along the Baltic trade routes, and royal visits to coastal towns were both political theatre and opportunities to collect maritime intelligence. Quirky tidbit: some fishing villages supplemented their income by selling trinkets to sailors, tiny carved ships among them, often claiming these miniatures brought safe passage. Historians still argue whether these sales were genuine tradition or just opportunistic marketing to passing crews. The first stop is a weather-beaten hamlet that smells of smoked herring and wet rope. As soon as the official inspection ends, the prince veers off toward a row of sheds near the waterline. Inside, you find an elderly woman seated at a bench, carving a hull from a piece of driftwood so deftly it seems the shape is already there, waiting for her to set it free. She doesn't work with bottles, her models stand proudly on little wooden cradles, but when the prince asks if she's ever tried glass, she smiles like she's been waiting for the question. From a shelf under her bench, she pulls out a dust-covered green bottle. Inside is a fishing boat, nets spread wide, with tiny silver fish carved from mother of pearl. The glass is cloudy, but the detail is remarkable. The prince buys it instantly, slipping her enough coin to replace the roof tiles missing from her shack. Over the next week, the hunt takes you from bustling market ports to almost forgotten harbors where the docks creak under your weight. In one place, a blacksmith proudly shows off a bottle ship that turns out to be a carved sardine wedged into a pickle jar. In another, you meet a boy no older than 10 who's somehow rigged a miniature warship with thread finer than a spider's web, his hands shaking as he passes it over, partly from cold, partly from disbelief that a prince wants his work. The weather doesn't make it easy. One afternoon, the wind off the sea is so sharp it feels like it could peel the skin from your face. The guards grumble, pulling their cloaks tighter, but the prince presses on toward a remote dock where, he's been told, a retired captain keeps a whole armada in bottles. The rumor proves half true, there are only 5, but one is so finely made it draws the prince's breath in. A sleek frigate, its sails stained the faint brown of old linen, rests above a sea made from layers of crushed lapis lazuli. The captain won't part with it easily. He demands not just money, but a promise that it will be displayed, not hidden away. The prince agrees, carefully leaving out the detail that displayed might mean only to himself and a select few in the attic. By the time you return to the palace, the spoils of the Great Baltic Hunt fill an entire trunk, 6 genuine bottle ships of varying quality, plus a few oddities the prince insists are charming despite their questionable craftsmanship. The attic workbench is soon lined with them, the glass catching the late afternoon light until the whole space seems afloat in a miniature sea. You realize this trip has changed something. Before, the collection felt like a secret hobby. Now, it feels like a fleet, one with ports scattered across the Baltic, each holding a story the prince can summon with a single glance into glass. And you suspect this is only the beginning of his expeditions. The Great Baltic Hunt might have filled a trunk, but it also planted a seed in the prince's mind. Some treasures aren't made for sale, they're salvaged from the sea itself. He hears whispers about bottle ships recovered from actual wrecks, relics pulled from the bellies of sunken merchantmen, each warped and stained by salt water but somehow still intact. The idea hooks him instantly. So here you are, ankle-deep in tidal pools along a ragged stretch of coast, your boots slipping on weed-slick rocks while gulls heckle you from above. The tide is out far enough that the ribs of an old fishing vessel jut from the sand like the bones of some great beached creature. The prince moves with a hunter's focus, scanning the shallows for anything that might glint under the grey light. Mainstream historical fact: coastal Denmark has long been littered with wrecks from centuries of fishing and trade, and low tide sometimes revealed pieces of them, timbers, cargo, even personal possessions. Quirky tidbit: in the 1600s, some sailors sealed keepsakes in bottles and tied them to parts of the ship in hopes they'd float free if disaster struck, a kind of maritime message in a bottle. Historians still argue whether this practice was a serious superstition or simply a romanticized legend. The first find of the day isn't glass, it's a carved figurehead's fragment, a wooden mermaid's face staring up at you from a pool, her features smoothed by years of waves. The prince examines it, then tucks it under his arm with the seriousness of a man adding a crown jewel to his treasury. You do eventually spot glass, a green bottle wedged between rocks, its neck encrusted with barnacles. Inside, the shape is hard to make out, clouded by sediment and age, but the curve of a sail is visible when the light hits just right. The prince kneels, running his fingers over the barnacles as though they're a script only he can read. "We'll open it carefully," he says, "so we keep the sea inside." Back at the palace, the attic turns into a kind of maritime surgery room. The bottle's crust is softened in warm water, the barnacles pried off with delicate taps. When the glass is finally clear enough to see through, you both lean in, and there it is. A small coastal trader, its masts tilted slightly, sails painted a cheerful red that somehow survived centuries underwater. The hull is warped, the sea base cracked, but the charm is undeniable. Not all salvages are so lucky. Another wreck yields only half a ship, the rest rotted away, the bottle cracked beyond repair. The prince keeps it anyway, setting it on a separate shelf he dubs the Lost Fleet. He seems oddly protective of these broken ones, as though their damage makes them more real. One evening, he brings up a lantern and sets it among the salvaged pieces. The flicker of the flame turns the warped glass into living water, and for a moment you swear the ships are moving, riding invisible swells toward a horizon only they can see. The prince watches them in silence, and you get the feeling that for him, these aren't just objects. They're pieces of history pulled from the teeth of the sea, survivors in miniature. By the time summer rolls in, word of the prince's unusual hobby has drifted far beyond the palace walls. You first catch wind of it from a merchant unloading crates in the harbor. He mutters something about that Danish boy with a navy in bottles and laughs. But the laughter fades when he mentions a name, Baron Ulrich von Strelitz, a foreign noble from the German states, who supposedly owns the largest private collection of ship models in Northern Europe. The rumor gains weight when a formal letter arrives, sealed with the Baron's crest. It's equal parts cordial greeting and thinly veiled challenge. "I have heard of your Highness's collection and would be delighted to compare our respective fleets in person." The prince reads it twice, then sets it down with a grin that is only partly amused. "His boasting," he says. "We'll see if he has reason to." Mainstream historical fact: nobility in the 17th century often competed in collecting, whether it was art, rare books, or curiosities, turning their acquisitions into status symbols as potent as political alliances. Quirky tidbit: some wealthy collectors kept feud lists, informal tallies of who had better or rarer items, using them to fuel social rivalries. Historians still argue whether such rivalries were purely vanity or covert diplomacy in disguise. When the Baron arrives weeks later, It's in a carriage so ostentatious it could probably be seen from space if space travel existed. He brings with him a lacquered trunk the size of a small coffin, carried by 2 sweating footmen. The court gathers in the great hall to watch as it's set down with ceremonial thuds. From within, the Baron produces 3 bottle ships in quick succession, a gilded carrack with sails thin as parchment, a squat merchant cog with barrels strapped to the deck, and most impressive, a double bottle display in which a single long ship passes through 2 joined spheres of glass. Gasps ripple through the crowd. The Baron basks in it. The prince waits until the oohs and ahs subside before having 2 guards carry in a covered tray. When the cloth is whisked away, it reveals not 3, but 5 ships, each with its own distinct quirk, one with actual strands of human hair for rigging, another with a carved ivory figurehead so detailed you can see the folds of its dress, and, his centerpiece, a model of the Roskilde with every cannon rendered in pewter. The room buzzes with murmurs. The Baron leans in to inspect the Roskilde, his expression carefully neutral, but you notice how long he lingers on it. After a tense silence, he concedes with a slight bow of the head, impressive craftsmanship. Later, when the guests have gone and the court returns to its usual hum, the prince leans back in his chair with the air of someone who's just won a duel without drawing blood. "We'll need something even stranger for the next time," he muses. "Something no one else has." You can tell by the gleam in his eyes that this isn't just about ships anymore, it's about never letting anyone else sail ahead. You've barely caught your breath from the Baron's visit when the prince starts pacing his study like a general plotting a siege. "If they want to talk about ships," he says, "we'll give them something they can't stop talking about." His gaze flicks toward you. "We're opening the museum." The word hangs in the air, grand and ridiculous at once. But he's already halfway up the spiral stairs before you can point out that most museums aren't run in attics by teenagers with a glue addiction. Mainstream historical fact: private collections were often shown by appointment in aristocratic homes during the 17th century, sometimes by candlelight to enhance the drama. Quirky tidbit: a few eccentric nobles only displayed their collections at night, claiming the shadows made rare objects reveal their true nature. Historians still argue whether this was for atmosphere or to avoid nosy daytime visitors. The attic transforms over the next week. Bottles are polished until they gleam under lamplight, each set on its own velvet-covered pedestal borrowed from the palace's formal dining hall. The Lost Fleet gets its own corner, lit by a single lantern so the warped glass glows like amber. Even the tools and scraps on the workbench are arranged just so, as if they're artifacts themselves. The first guests are handpicked, a few trusted servants, the palace librarian, and a stable boy who once helped carry a suspiciously bottle-shaped package past the guards without asking questions. They file in quietly, eyes wide, the air thick with that hush people use in holy places. The prince becomes a guide, his voice low but carrying easily over the creak of the floorboards. He tells the story of each ship, where it came from, what odd bargain was struck to acquire it. For the salvaged red-sailed trader, he even dims the lantern so the warped hull looks like it's still underwater. Word spreads faster than either of you expect. Soon, visitors arrive in small groups after dusk, slipping up the back stairs with the discretion of thieves. You hear laughter when someone spots the fishing boat with mother-of-pearl fish. You hear sighs when they see the lapis lazuli sea in the captain's frigate. A merchant from the city murmurs, "I've never seen anything like it," and you can tell he means it. Of course, the secrecy adds to the allure. People love to feel they've been let into something forbidden. By the 4th week, you find a note slipped under the attic door. What would it take for a private viewing? The prince chuckles and pins it to the wall, not answering yet. One night, after the last guest leaves, you both sit among the bottles, the room still warm from candlelight. The ships gleam in the fading glow, each trapped in its perfect, impossible voyage. "They'll talk about this," the prince says softly, "long after the candles burn out. You believe him. It starts with a drawing on the prince's desk, bigger, bolder than anything you've seen him attempt before. A four-masted ship, every sail billowing, every line of rigging mapped out like the veins of a leaf. Beside it, the outline of a bottle, or at least what's supposed to be a bottle. It's comically small compared to the ship sketched beside it. You see the problem, he says, tapping the parchment. Oh yes, you reply. It's called physics. Mainstream historical fact. Traditional ship-in-a-bottle building involves folding the masts flat, inserting the hull, and then raising the masts with threads inside the bottle. Quirky tidbit. Some model makers have been known to construct entire ships inside two halves of a bottle, then seal the glass so perfectly that the seam disappears. Historians still argue whether these seamless bottles were genuine feats of skill or the result of secret collaborations with glassblowers. The prince insists the ship must be full-sized within the scale, no cutting down masts, no trimming sails. We'll make the bottle fit the ship, not the other way around. Which sounds bold, until you see him wrestling with an actual oversized bottle a few days later, its neck barely wide enough to admit a matchstick. The first attempt ends in a flurry of muttered curses, polite, court-approved ones, but curses nonetheless, when the bowsprit refuses to pass the bottleneck. The second attempt involves dismantling the hull into even smaller pieces, which results in one mast snapping in half like a breadstick. You salvage the pieces, but the look on the prince's face makes you quietly edge toward the trapdoor before he remembers to breathe. By the third try, the attic has become a battlefield of tiny planks, rigging threads, and empty teacups. The bottle is propped at an angle on a custom-made stand, and you're holding a lantern close so he can see every detail. The masts fold perfectly this time. The hull slides in with a satisfying clink against the glass bottom. For a moment, you think it's going to work. Then one of the sails catches on the bottleneck and crumples like wet parchment. The prince freezes, tweezers poised midair. You can feel the whole room holding its breath. Slowly, painstakingly, he coaxes the sail free without tearing it, guiding the mast upright until it clicks into place like a lock turning. When it's finally done, the oversized masterpiece sits inside its bottle like it's been there forever. You both stare at it, too tired to celebrate, too awed to speak. It's absurdly large for the glass, leaving barely any space between the tips of the masts and the curve of the bottle. But it fits. That night, he places it in the center of the attic display. It nearly killed us, he says with a grin, but look at it. And you do, because you know that for him, it's not just a ship in a bottle. It's proof that he can make the impossible obey. You're halfway through dusting the display shelves when the trouble starts. A palace maid slips in, looking as though she's carrying a scandal in her apron. She leans close and whispers, "They say one of your ships belonged to a pirate." The prince laughs at first, the easy kind that says, "Surely not." But then she describes it, the black-hulled brigantine with crimson sails, the one you both salvaged from an old chest in the harbour master's storehouse. Mainstream historical fact. During the late 17th century, piracy in the Baltic Sea was less romantic than in the Caribbean but just as disruptive, with privateers and smugglers often sailing the same routes as merchants. Quirky tidbit. Some pirate captains commissioned miniature replicas of their ships as tokens of loyalty or as bargaining gifts for safe passage. Historians still argue whether these were purely decorative or coded maps in disguise. The rumor slithers through the palace corridors faster than you can swat it down. The Queen Mother hears it. The Baron, yes, that Baron, hears it. By the week's end, even the stable boys are betting on whether the Kingtabis prized brigantine once hauled stolen silks from the Mediterranean. The prince takes it with unnerving calm, but you can see the flicker of irritation behind his eyes. He starts digging for proof, sending letters to shipwrights, summoning aging sailors to the palace for friendly chats. One old mariner squints at the model for nearly a minute before saying, "Aye, she looks like the Night Widow." Fast ship, faster captain. The man won't say more, only mutters something about bad luck before leaving in a hurry. The court gossip turns sharper. Why would a prince display a pirate's ship? What kind of example is that? You half expect an official order to remove it from the collection, but the prince does something far stranger. He moves the brigantine to the center of the display. Visitors see it first when they enter, its dark hull gleaming under lamplight, its crimson sails casting a shadow over the velvet. Let them wonder, he says, almost daring the whispers to grow louder. You're not sure if it's bravado or strategy, but the effect is undeniable. The scandal turns the Attic Museum into a must-see attraction. Every guest leaves with the same lingering question, was it really a pirate's ship? And the prince, well, he never answers. It happens during one of the quieter evenings, when the attic smells faintly of lamp oil and varnish, and the soft clink of glass echoes under the beams. The prince is leaning over the big bottle masterpiece, you know, the one that nearly ended both your sanity and your friendship with gravity, when a deep creak shivers through the floorboards. You both freeze. Then comes another sound, softer, like glass whispering against glass. The nearest bottle trembles, just a hair, but enough for your stomach to drop. Mainstream historical fact, old buildings, especially those with wooden beams like the palace's upper floors, can shift with temperature changes, causing slight but dangerous movement in displayed collections. Quirky tidbit: some Victorian collectors sprinkled fine sand under their displays so they could hear the vibrations of intruders. Historians still argue whether this was effective security or just a charming eccentricity. A week later, the prince invites a glassblower named Jens, stooped, with hands as steady as marble statues, to inspect the collection. Jens runs his fingers over each bottle's neck, the way a doctor might feel a pulse, and frowns. This attic was never meant for such. Wait. His eyes flick to the grand centerpiece bottle. One sharp tremor, one heavy footstep, and he lets the sentence hang. The prince is already pulling out parchment for sketches. His solution? A reinforced display case with individual padded cradles for each bottle, glass domes over the most fragile pieces, and a locking mechanism that would confuse a locksmith. You spend 3 nights helping him assemble it, the air thick with sawdust and the occasional muttered complaint about splinters. When it's done, the attic looks transformed. Each ship sits inside its own little stage, safe from wandering elbows and sudden gusts from the trapdoor. The brigantine with crimson sails gleams like a jewel under its new dome, as if it knows it's been promoted from scandal to star exhibit. That night, the two of you linger in the attic after the candles burn low. The creaks in the floor still come, but the bottles stay still, unmoved by the shifting wood. The prince watches the glass domes catch the last flicker of light. We've made them safe, he says quietly. Now they can outlast us. The thought is oddly comforting and, if you're honest, a little eerie. You think the attic is secure now, tucked away behind its reinforced displays, the ships safe in their glass cocoons. But peace never lasts long in a palace. This time, it's the king's own advisors who bring trouble, dressed in their best robes, armed with polite smiles that hide barbed hooks. They arrive unannounced, 3 of them, their footsteps heavy on the attic stairs. The tallest clears his throat. His Majesty feels your hobby has become something of a public spectacle. The prince doesn't flinch, but you can see his jaw tighten. One advisor gestures toward the brigantine with crimson sails. Rumors persist. A pirate's vessel displayed so prominently, how will this reflect on the crown? Another adds, and the cost. Imported bottles, rare woods, glass domes. The court is beginning to ask questions. Mainstream historical fact: royal courts often scrutinized a prince's spending habits, especially on collections, fearing they might drain funds from more serious endeavors. Quirky tidbit: one 18th century European prince kept a personal zoo of miniature horses in a palace wing, justifying it as research. Historians still argue whether this was eccentricity or an intentional political distraction. The prince listens quietly, then walks over to the crimson-sailed brigantine. He runs a finger along the curve of its hull and says, "Do you know what this ship represents?" The advisors exchange wary glances. Ingenuity. Patience. The craft of men who work unseen so that beauty can endure. One of them coughs. "Beauty does not win wars. Neither do grim rooms and empty mines," the prince replies, and there's steel under the silk in his voice. If the people know their future king values art, perhaps they'll believe he values them. It's not a dismissal, exactly, but the advisors leave without pressing further. You watch their robes vanish down the stairs, the air they leave behind feeling both lighter and charged. That night, the prince moves the oversized four-masted masterpiece to stand beside the brigantine. Side by side, they're defiant in their beauty, one built through impossible precision, the other carrying the weight of whispered scandal. Together, they're a statement: I will decide what is worth keeping. You suspect the advisors will be back. But so will you. Winter arrives like an uninvited guest, slamming the shutters, icing the window panes, and sneaking drafts through the attic boards. The ships, safe in their domes, seem to shrink into themselves under the dim light, their sails catching only the weakest glow from the lamps. The prince insists on visiting every night anyway, bundled in a fur-lined cloak, breath fogging in the air. You notice it first while wiping the inside of one display dome, tiny beads of moisture on the glass. Condensation. It's harmless now, but in time it could warp the wooden hulls or rust the delicate wire rigging. Mainstream historical fact: wooden artifacts are vulnerable to sudden changes in humidity, especially during seasonal shifts, which can cause swelling, cracking, or mold growth. Quirky tidbit: in the 19th century, some collectors stored prized models in rooms lined with bowls of salt to absorb excess moisture. Historians still argue whether this worked or simply made the room smell faintly like a fishmonger's stall. The prince doesn't hesitate. "We'll keep the air steady." He summons a craftsman known in the market for building peculiar contraptions, half stove, half pump, all rattling brass and polished copper. The device hums like a contented cat when it's running, circulating air through narrow pipes and holding the attic's climate in a steady balance. The first night it's switched on, the attic feels almost alive with its soft mechanical heartbeat. The glass domes stay clear, the sails stay crisp, and the wood smells faintly of varnish instead of damp. The prince lingers by the brigantine, fingers tapping idly against the dome as if keeping time with the machine. "This is how they'll survive the centuries," he says. "Even when we're just names in a book." Outside, the snow falls heavier, muffling the world. Inside, the little ships sail on in their bottled seas, untouched by frost or time. You realize the attic is no longer just a room. It's a fortress for dreams, sealed against the bite of the world. The years pass almost imperceptibly, marked not by palace events or foreign envoys but by the slow, deliberate addition of ships to glass. You notice the prince's hands first, how the sure, quick motions of youth have become slower, more deliberate. The lines at the corners of his eyes deepen, but his focus on the miniature decks remains razor-sharp. This winter, he calls you to the attic alone. No guards, no advisors, no curious servants trailing behind. On the workbench rests a single empty bottle, taller than most, its glass perfectly clear, its neck surprisingly narrow. "This," he says softly, "will be my last." Mainstream historical fact: some rulers of the early modern period created a final work to mark the closing chapter of their reign or personal legacy, often commissioning an object meant to be passed down unchanged. Quirky tidbit: a Japanese shogun once sealed his final poem inside a lacquered box and ordered it never to be opened. Historians still argue whether it contained a hidden message or was simply a poem. The model is a small caravel, plain in shape but intricate in detail, its sails slightly billowed as if catching a gentle wind, its deck busy with tiny ropes and coiled lines. You help him thread the masts through the neck, each step measured, no rush. His breathing is steady but heavier than you remember. Hours pass in the amber light of the attic lamp. At last, the ship rests inside the bottle, every line perfect. He seals the cork with a drip of wax the color of dark honey. His fingers linger there, as if holding the moment in place. When he finally speaks, it's barely above a whisper. These ships, they are my letters to the future. Whoever looks upon them will know I was here. You feel the weight of the silence that follows. Outside, the snow hushes the palace grounds. Inside, the last ship gleams beneath its dome, a quiet testament to patience, curiosity, and a life spent bending time into glass. With the last flicker of the lamp catching the curve of that final bottle, the story begins to slow, as all good stories do. The attic air feels warmer, softer, as though the years of work and laughter and whispered plans have settled into the beams themselves. You notice how each ship, whether scandalous brigantine or humble fishing sloop, seems to glow in the dim light, the glass holding not just the craft but the moments that shaped it. The prince, no, the king now, sits in his chair, eyes closed, not sleeping but listening. Perhaps to the faint hum of the climate machine, perhaps to some imagined ocean tide rolling far beyond the palace walls. The shadows stretch, and the world outside the attic fades to a gentle blur. You breathe slower. The snow outside drapes the night in quiet layers. The ships stand frozen in their eternal voyages, little worlds within worlds, drifting through an endless calm. There's nothing left to fix, no gossip to chase, no frost to battle, only the steady rhythm of time itself, carrying you along like a slow, sure current. And when you finally step away, the attic door closing softly behind you, the glow from within lingers in your mind like the afterimage of a dream. Somewhere, the king is still there, leaning over his glass fleet, sending them on journeys you can almost see.